So now that we have our data, main forecast.swift here, which will help us when we start using the JSON decoder to actually decode what we get from our API from here to something that we can manage in SwiftUI, we're going to add a service. So the service is going to obviously allow us to go and fetch the data, right? So inside of service here, I'm going to go ahead and say new file. It's going to be a Swift file, that's fine. And it's going to be service as such. And I already have the code, so I'm not going to bore you and get all of that. So I'm going to copy all the code, get rid of all of that, and paste it all in. Now this code is very simple in essence. So let me quickly walk you through what's going on here. So first of all, we have here our API ID. So this is where I actually put your own API ID, please. You should have your own, so just paste it all in there. And then we have this function called getWeatherData, which allows us to pass the city as a string. Then we have a completion here. So the completion here expects to have a forecast weather response, which again is all of this payload here. Okay, so we want everything. Remember this one here, if we go ahead and get the definition, we are getting this forecast weather response here, which has city, the code, message, and all this information that we want. Okay, that's what we're doing here. And of course, we are passing in the URL. So to construct this whole URL where we are fetching this data from, or JSON, and we're passing all sort of things there. Of course, first of all, we're passing the city, which is this city here that we are going to be entering in our application. And then we are invoking the URL session and invoke the data task, which we pass the URL, and we expect a raw data of some sort, as well as response and error if something happens. So the moment that we have all that information, we know, for instance, that we have the data, hopefully we are going to proceed. Okay, so if we have the data, we're going to give that data there. Else, we're just going to say, hey, something is wrong, just pass in nil, and we move on. Okay, now here's the part where we have the information we want. So here is the weather response, the actual information that we're mapping with our forecast weather response. So notice here we're using JSON decoder and we're invoking the decode. And for that, we have to pass the type that we want to use to decode, right? So we're saying here, all of this information that we're getting, we need to kind of map it with what? With the forecast weather response. Okay, that's what we're doing there. And of course, we are just making sure that if all is good in completion, that's when we are going to have this weather response, because we know that now we have all decoded, we have the actual JSON that we can use to start showing. Okay, so that's what we're doing with our service here. Very simple and to the point. Now, I have a lot of comments here. You don't have to worry about them, but if you want to play around, of course, later you can go ahead and uncomment a few things here and see what happens. But in any case, this should do the job. Of course, the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we are able to actually call this service and hopefully see something. And what I'm going to do actually, I'm going to go ahead and print out this weather response just to see if we're actually getting what we need. Next, what we're going to do, we're going to create an actual view model because we want to make sure that we separate the concerns here. So we have the user interface and we have the backend. So we want to get all of the things from the backend in one place and then update the user interface. There's different ways to do so, but in this case, to facilitate our lives, I'm going to create another file here. This file here is going to be a SwiftUI. I'm going to say next, and let's call this forecast view model like that. So the forecast view model here, in fact, it's just going to be a class. I'm going to call this class. I'm going to change a few things here. And it's going to be an observable. The reason why I want this to be an observable is because I want to make sure that once this class is called, it's going to be able to broadcast the message to all of the views that are using this forecast view model and let those views to actually get the new data or updated data and so forth. So all the transactions are going to happen automatically. So if something changes from the service, it's going to broadcast those changes in every view that it has, and all other views will be able to see them. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of all of this, of course, because that's all unnecessary. Of course, we don't need this because that's not a SwiftUI anymore. And this has to be combined. Okay, that's what I'm going to be importing. And I'm also going to import, in this case, SwiftUI, just to have that. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to say var weather service as such is going to be of type services, okay, which we created earlier. And in this case here, I'm going to just go ahead and say var city name is going to be a string. And for now, I'm just going to say Boston as the default city. Okay. Okay, next I'm going to create a published variable here. okay, because it needs to be able to actually get the information. I'm going to say var weather forecast, and I'm going to set it to the forecast weather response object. So we're going to instantiate it as such. And right away, I'm going to go ahead and actually initialize it. I'm going to call the init. I'm not passing anything. And the state, I'm going to say self, that weather service is going to be equal to services. And this has to be observable, not observed. There we go, observable object as such. So at this point here, this weather forecast, we can always use it to show information. What I mean by that is as follows. At this point here, our weather forecast should have information that we want. Next, I'm going to create a function here, and this is going to be called search city as such. I don't have to pass anything. It doesn't return anything really. And I'm going to say if let city be equal to self dot city name. And in this case here, I want to say dot adding percent encoding. I'm going to say with, I'm going to say dot URL host allowed. This will make sure to sanitize our city that has been added. So if there's spaces or something is not quite right, it will know how to make sure that this string that we're passing is actually sanitized. All right, and then here, because it's a closure, I have to go ahead and return something. Go ahead and call fetch weather forecast, and I'm going to say by city. We haven't created this yet. I'm going to create right now. Out here, it's going to be func, and let's say by city. It's expecting a string. So here is where we are actually going to go and fetch that weather forecast. So what happens here is that this fetch weather forecast is being called right when we pass the city, search city. So that's called. I'm going to go ahead and call the weather forecast, and we pass that city. So this is where we do the work. So I'm going to go ahead and say self dot. I'm going to get the weather service, again, the weather service that we instantiated at the top here, okay, or initialize there. And what I want to do with that? Well, I want to go ahead and say get weather method and pass the city. In this case, the city is going to be what? City name, okay? And for completion, what I need to happen, I'm going to say forecast in, right? I'm going to go ahead and say if let forecast as such, and I'm going to go ahead and call the dispatch queue, okay? I'm going to go put in main.async, and I'm pass the code here. So right then, I'm going to say self that weather forecast, remember the weather forecast upstairs, it's going to be equal to this forecast. What's happening here is that each time that something changes, we're going to obviously go ahead and call the get weather city. If the city name changes, we want to be able to go ahead and fetch the information. But for that to happen, we actually have to go to the main thread again, a different thread, for us to populate our weather forecast here, which is published, which means anybody can listen and get information from, and add that forecast, which will contain all the information, meaning the entire payload. Okay, very good. So we did a lot of coding here. In the next video, we're going to see hopefully something showing on the screen, or at least in our console, so we can see that indeed we're able to fetch something from the API.